Guys, Behaviors Devs decided to grace us with a Q&A live stream where they talked about things that are happening with Dead by Daylight and gave us answers of soon. And we're looking into it, and we can't really talk about that right now. But I think what most people were looking for out of this live stream was two things. One, would boons be addressed? And two, would skill-based matchmaking be addressed as well? As far as boons are concerned, they gave us the fact that Circle of Healing would get a 25% nerf from 100% healing speed down to 75% healing speed, which I think adds 4 extra seconds to a heal, which is still very strong because one of the major issues with Circle of Healing is its range, how hard it is to actually go out of your way to deal with the totem once it's set up, and the fact that it's very easy to reestablish it. But we'll have to see how that nerf works out. They did say that the boon system is working as intended and that they have no intentions to change the actual system of boons, but they will look at individual perks. But my main gripe with behavior right now, with Dead by Daylight, and it seems like a major gripe of the majority of the Dead by Daylight community, is actually just the skill-based matchmaking system. A system introduced in September, and since its release in September has seen a 22% average player drop from 51,000 down to 40,000. But if we're going to be fair about the numbers, in January last year, the player base had 36,000 players. It's now up to 40,000. So in theory, the player base has grown. But if we're going to look at what happened in June, we did see a peak player number of 105,000, which has dropped now down to 40,000. So yes, games do go through seasonality, and they are more popular in summer than they are in the winter months, obviously in the northern hemisphere for you Aussies and everyone down south. But this is a major drop from 105 peak down to 40,000 average, and it clearly shows that since September, the player base has not been happy. And I've done my own polls that I've talked about, for example, this one, which is basically aimed at people who comment that they've left Dead by Daylight and why have they. 35,000 voted. 55% said that they left due to skill-based matchmaking and MMR. And so they did talk about skill-based matchmaking in their dev live stream. We had this lovely quote from Patrick.
But there's a common misconception that by using just kills and escapes to adjust your MMR, it's ignoring skill in the game. This isn't the truth, though. This is false.
Okay, Patrick, but do you remember in October when you said this?
Like, wouldn't that be nice? That's the idea. That's all MMR is trying to do, is it goes, I know that you died. It's ignoring how you got there because there's too much nuance to be able to make a real effective system. So we just ignore that.
Okay, so you do ignore it. It's one thing one day, another thing the other day. I mean, at this point, it seems like Patrick behavior, they don't want to give us the details. They don't want to admit that things aren't going well for them. It's like the captain of the Titanic telling people to stay on board after hitting the iceberg. Don't worry, guys. We'll make it to America very soon. Just got to patch up this little hole. It's insane. However, one of the more insane things that did happen in the dev live stream is that Patrick decided to compare Dead by Daylight to hockey. And I get that he's Canadian, but just listen to what he has to say.
Think about sports, and I'll use hockey as an example because I'm Canadian. You wouldn't say they only count wins when placing teams in the standings, but they should also count shots on goal too. A more skilled player takes more shots. And while that's certainly true, it's important to remember that shots lead to goals, which lead to wins. So you can kind of cut the middleman out there.
Oh, Patrick. Dead by Daylight is not hockey, man. Like, in no way can you compare an asymmetric 1v4 game to a game of hockey. A team game where people have different roles that are trying to attempt the same goals, score goals, defend goals, but both teams are trying to do the same thing. It is just not comparable. The killer is not trying to repair a generator quickly and escape. The survivors aren't trying to hit and down and kill the killer because it's 1v4. It's an asymmetrical title. So yes, actually, you do need to start looking at some of these other factors because in hockey, you can make that argument. In football, in soccer, in rugby, you can make the argument when two teams have the same goal. Maybe you can stop looking at the other stats that really compare the people in the team and just focus on the end result. And that will show which team was better on the day. But Dead by Daylight is asymmetrical, And because of that, you actually do need to look at some of these nuances if you want to make a skill-based matchmaking system, not an escape-based one. They've already admitted that they're not going to look at the nuances, but it's just mind-blowing that Patrick has decided to compare DBD to hockey. And the craziest thing for me is that they have confirmed, the devs themselves, in the previous dev live streams, that as far as matchmaking is concerned, the game treats the matchmaking as a 1v1v1v1v1 system. So the killers, MMR, is versus the 4 survivors individually. And that means that if a Dwight manages to loop a Bubba 5 generators and then takes a no-hit hit on the back, downing him, he then gets face camped, of course, because the game is over. And then the 3 Claudettes who did the generators decide to escape. Then the Dwight loses rating in that game, whilst the 3 Claudettes who did the generator are now escaping and gaining MMR. And overall, this doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things because it's a rare scenario and the game will, rectify and rebalance itself eventually over time. But this is a key example of how nuance is actually really important in Dead by Daylight and where this hockey analogy just doesn't make any sense because in theory, Behavior could implement their bot system that they use in the tutorials, and I could play versus a killer and loop the killer for 5 generators, and the bots will do the generators for me. And then they'll open the exit gate, and they will probably escape if they have the opportunity to. I guarantee you, using Behavior's terrible AI bots that they use in their game tutorial, that if I looped a killer for 5 gens and those bots completed the objective, then escaped, and I died in that match, that could be comparable to some games of Dead by Daylight that I've played. But were those AI bots better than me? The game certainly thinks they were because they managed to cross the exit line. There's no nuance in this. An incredible goal scorer in hockey is now considered absolutely the same as the person who warms the benches and hands the Gatorade out at the end of the game. And it just is absolutely insane that Behavior are trying to justify this to us with shitty hockey analogies, but secondly, that they're not even considering the actual implications of the analogies that they're bringing to the table. And it still is mind-blowing to me that they're trying to force a competitive matchmaking system into a game that they have always intended to be casually played. Now, here's an interesting one where someone asked, would it be possible to change skill-based matchmaking system to essentially take hooks into account when you're playing? And I have my own thoughts on this, which is that yes, a match where a killer gets 4 hooks and wins compared to a match where a killer gets 12 hooks and wins typically will indicate that there was more of a battle between the survivors and killers, which in theory could mean that match was worth more as far as rating is concerned. That is something you can conclude from a match, and it wouldn't be an unfair assessment either. However, hooks aren't a killer resource as far as I'm concerned. The survivors have the 3 hook states. The killer's only objective is to kill them, right? And so a killer shouldn't necessarily be negatively punished for getting a quick match where they apply a lot of pressure and execute off survivor mistake by slugging, whatever it may be, or killing the survivors quickly because the survivors messed up. I've always kind of not enjoyed this argument that hooks should be used as a killer rating or an indicator of killer skill, because it's not the killer's job to hook the survivors multiple times. It's the survivor's job to try and make the killer hook the survivors multiple times so that they can actually have more time in the game. And yes, as a killer, you can go out and challenge yourself to not go after someone who's been hooked, to hook everyone once, then hook everyone twice, then hook everyone a 3rd time, and try and make that a 4K. And if you can go out and do that and purposely play inefficiently and still get a 4K, then yeah, sure, you did something that was somewhat skillful by applying pressure in a different way. But that is not your job as killer, nor should it be an objective of the killer. And so Patrick did have to talk about this, and his response was a little bit weird because it makes me think that he doesn't understand something about sports. I suppose it makes sense considering he watches hockey.
Why don't hooks count towards your rating?
Yeah, this is a great example of what I was just talking about a minute ago, in a specific case that we did consider and look at and think about quite a bit. The thing with counting hooks is that you end up with weird cases that don't make sense when you take it to its extremes. Say you're a killer who hooked every survivor twice, but none of them died. If you count those hooks towards your rating, then you can easily end up in a situation where that scenario counts as a win, like moves you up the standings, but that feels weird. Did you really win? Should your rating go up and make you face stronger opponents, even though all of the survivors got out alive? That probably not, right? That's like an obvious moment of like, it doesn't really compute.
He doesn't get what a draw is. And it makes sense because in hockey, if the teams are tied at the end of the match, then I think they get 5 minutes overtime. And if there's still no winner after that, then they do a shootout to determine the winner. A game has to end in a winner in a game of hockey. But Dead by Daylight, again, is not hockey. Amazingly. Surprisingly. It's an asymmetric 1v4. And you never defined a win condition behavior. Ever. Like, explicitly went out of your way to try and make it so people could play the game how they wanted to. But then you implemented a basic win condition into MMR that ignores the nuanced results of everything. And in your dev live stream, you said that you try to balance killers to have a 2k kill ratio. 2 kills, 2 escapes. That's essentially what you consider balance, which would mean that's what you consider a draw. But you're not implementing draws into your matchmaking system. No one's asking to get wins in their MMR. They just want their MMR to give them better games overall. Games that are not as stressful, games that are not as sweaty, games that they can actually sit down at the end of a hard day of work and play a game or two of Dead by Daylight and not want to uninstall afterwards. That is what people want from your matchmaking system. And so in a match of Dead by Daylight where a killer, like a Bubba for example, gets 4 hooks total, kills 2 survivors from those 4 hooks, that game is considered more of a win than a game where a killer managed to get 8 hooks total by hooking every survivor twice and then the survivors escaped. If you go out of your way to hook everyone more than once, then you are having to do a lot more work as killer. And so in theory, you could argue that you're more skilled than the guy who face camps 2 people to death. But the MMR system disagrees with that because it will say that you lost at the end of the game. You'll go against worse opponents, which means in theory, if you guys want to D-rank whilst having some form of fun, then you should just never kill anyone in Dead by Daylight. Try to 2-hook them. Maybe you get a 3rd hook if you're really lucky, but you shouldn't be doing that because your games will be harder. It's just insane that this guy continues to force feed us bullshit with a shit-eating grin, and I just don't understand it. And I have my own thoughts about skill-based matchmaking. I think that it works okay in competitive matches, but when you try and put it in casual games, it doesn't make as much sense. You could definitely use a better matchmaking system like an experience-based matchmaking system, which takes into account how many hours you have total, how many hours you've played recently, and tries to match you with similar houred people overall. And then it doesn't matter what the win conditions are. All that matters is how often you play the game, and you're playing against other people who play almost as similarly as you. And I think that if you were to implement something simple like that has no win conditions and the only metric that matters is hours played, minutes played, I think you'd probably have a more fun casual video game for yourself. But perhaps behavior ramping up in 2022 to release the World Championship of Dead by Daylight esports. And if that's the case, then I'll have to throw my hat into the ring to be a commentator for that. I'm sorry, Patrick. I actually really love you. Primus is a great band, and Jerry Was a Race Car Driver is a great song. Oh man, I'm just so done at this point.